Welcome to the UST Education recorded webinar series. This session is powered by US Transactions. UST is a boutique payment processing firm providing you with personalized service. We offer agnostic, best fit technology solutions for associations, nonprofits, and enterprise clients.
We good? Okay. So Paul, get started. Paul and I are excited to be here today to talk about operating reserves. Quick background, I'm Mike Gelman. I'm coming to you from Washington, D.C. is my home base. Spent my whole career working with nonprofit organizations, most of that time in public accounting on the consulting side, sitting between a CFO, Chief Financial Officer, and a CSO, Chief Strategy Officer, helping organizations with sustainability, short and intermediate planning, and related fiscal and financial governance issues. Come to you now from Fiscal Strategies for Nonprofit, we're a consulting group supporting the C-suite. And we also have Sustainability Education for Nonprofits. It's an all-volunteer website offering information for organizations related to fiscal, financial, legal, and governance. We post every week. Just in the chat, I put up for you a link on operating reserves. You'll see we write on this, have podcasts and templates and things that are available. I spent my time in about thirds, a third doing consulting work, a third doing classes like this. My home base for teaching is out of Georgetown University, but do a lot of classes with ASAE, U.S. Chamber of Commerce, and for a lot of organizations like United Way and such. And then my wife and I, we try to spend a third of our time being active volunteers with nonprofits serving on boards. Paul, I'll throw it to you.
Thanks, Mike. Good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you're calling in from. My name is Paul Preziati, and I'm a partner with Johnson Lambert. A little bit about our firm. We're a national CPA firm that provides audit, tax, internal audit, and consulting services to the nonprofit, employee benefit plan, and insurance sectors. And myself, I co-lead our national nonprofit practice. Similar to Mike, in addition to my day job, spend a lot of time giving presentations such as these and also serving and volunteering on boards. And I'll echo Mike's sentiments there. If you haven't done it before, it's great both on a personal and professional level. It really gives you a lot of perspective. Without further ado, because this is a topic we could talk about for 3 hours here, let's get into operating reserves. And we've got a lot of learning objectives here. Mike, I think this is one of those evergreen topics that it's always useful to circle back to. Would you agree?
100% agree, Paul. And I think what we want to try to do is, I think most people understand the terms operating reserve policies, but we want to connect that to financial health, sustainability, and as a communications tool. Because I think out there people take it for granted, but don't really understand the real purpose behind operating reserves. And I think we can do a better job communicating that to people and such. And so you're going to see we broke this into 5 areas. We're going to roughly spend a little bit of time in each, and we got a quick couple of case study examples at the very end we want to walk you through. But Paul, my favorite one is looking at operating reserves as a key indicator of financial health. And we've talked about this. There is no one single indicator, but my own personal bias, I can talk about that, is when I open up a financial statement, I'm always looking there, trying to see where they're at operating reserve wise. And I think you do too. And
I
then
do, but it's also not a natural thing to do too, and that's one thing we'll talk about because the statement of activities for a nonprofit organization, it's a little easier to decipher, especially for the common user of a set of nonprofit financial statements who might not have a financial background. Whereas looking at operating reserves, that can take a little more time.
Exactly. And then we're going to talk about the long-term purpose versus the short-term and what's the differences. And even organizations that have small amounts of operating reserves, they need to know about the long-term gain. And then help with a few tricks to connect with board engagement on this. And then, Paul, one of my favorites is tying the operating reserve policy into a budgeting guideline. And then we'll take a look about when it's appropriate short-term, long-term uses. So with that, let's just go ahead and jump in. And Paul, don't you think the statement sort of says it all? It's a strategic financial thing, but organizations that have accumulated operating reserves are in a totally different position than organizations that do not have operating reserves.
I would agree. And, given all that's happened the past 6 or 7 years, has come to light now more than ever because we've had organizations, you say the operating reserves are for a rainy day. Mike, we've had at least 2 or 3 rainy days, if not more, in the past 6 years.
Exactly. And Paul, I'm going to state one of my favorite things to say is, I have never met an organization that didn't have great ideas and aspirations. What I have met is 98% of them that don't have the working capital, the financial strength, the financial health to be able to go ahead and plow ahead and act on those ideas. And so that's the key here we want to talk about. It's this longevity perspective and this characteristic and put that out in front of people. And I think like a race, Paul, even though if you run a race, you and I are runners, right? We go out and run. If you don't know where the finish line is, you're not going to perform, right? And so the operating reserve provides that finish line. And I really think it helps on sustainability. And it's a badge of honor. And Paul, I could still say this after doing this for a long time. I've never seen an organization, a funder, a supporter, walk away from a well-funded organization. Okay, it just gives them this, I love that word comfort. Don't you agree?
Yeah, it shows that they are managing their reserves. It shows that they've got probably adequate controls. It just gives, as you said, a higher level of comfort there.
Exactly. So take a look at these real quick, and we're going to go over these. But these 8 issues, when someone sees operating reserves, not all of them pop through everybody's head, Paul, but one or two of these are going through, and it keys in on that governance. And my favorite one is right at the top, not by accident. That, you see an organization with operating reserves, it doesn't happen by accident. They must be like well managed. They must be stewarding their funds right and, and, and those kind of things. So I think it just sets the stage. But Paul, you comment on fiscal responsible. I think, don't you think it says that all these systems have to be in place for you to get operating reserves building?
Yeah, again, we talked about this earlier in the webinar that we could spend a lot of time on this, and I think we could spend 10 minutes each on all of these. But, you know, um, just taking a look at operating reserves, being in that positive position, again, there's so many benefits.
Exactly. And
Mike,
then,
we're getting a few requests on your audio in the chat that's breaking up a little bit.
okay. Okay. How do I sound now? Still the
Still
same?
the same.
Hmm. Okay. Let me switch over to a different microphone here. How do I sound now?
Still the same.
Okay. Not
I don't
better?
know if there's a material difference, so maybe if you could just speak up, Mike. We got quite a few comments on that in the
Okay.
chat.
Okay. Well, we'll just go back and I'll make
That's a
sure.
lot better. Whatever you just did. Good work.
Perfect. Okay. So let's just wrap up here, Paul, in these areas. The financial stability and then again, most people do not equate operating reserves with a lowering of risk management. That with operating reserves, a lot of risks that organizations are very tight on cash, don't have the resources, are always having to manage. And so, in recap here, it's a confidence builder, right? It projects steadiness and it increases trust. So, Paul, with that, can we go ahead and do our first polling question? And these are important for CAE and CPE credit.
Yeah, and as a friendly reminder, please type your answer into the chat in order to receive your CAE or CPE credit. And the question is this: does your organization make operating reserves a strategic financial priority? I hope everyone says yes to this. But if you don't, we would love to hear the rationale why.
And we're going to be talking about operating reserve policies here in a little bit. So that's why I see we sort of combine A and B, that it's there and that you have a policy sitting behind it. But I'm interested to see, Paul, what pops up.
Okay, so we're getting a lot of Bs. That's great. That's a good start. Don't you worry though. We'll make sure to talk about key performance indicators. And maybe it's the terminology there. I would bet you a lot of you have that, and you may just not be associating it with the wording, but we'll get into that in a little bit.
So, Paul, let's go on to section 2 here about the long-term purpose and its reminder. It's a balancing act between the short term and the long term, and I think people overestimate the short term. And that's okay. That's a risk management tool. It's nice to know that we have those funds sitting behind us. Paul, you like to say the rainy day funds, and it's that security that we have that, a small glitch won't send us sideways. But I think the long term is the real reason we have that. And a lot of this comes around like a life cycle, the long term versus the short term aspects of these, Paul. And initially, for organizations that are new, they're starting, the first thing you start with no reserves and everything. You're not even talking about, the long term, right? We want to get that first, 3 months. And as you can see here, Paul, we've talked about, been involved with the National Operating Reserve Initiative, the NOI project, and all the work that went around that. And the only thing hard conclusion that came out of that was not what's the ideal operating reserves, but where organizations are considered to be in a weakened position. And what we came up with is that organizations have less than 3 months of operating reserves, so they're in a weakened position. So I think that sets the bar at the minimum. You want to try to get to that 3 month if you have none. But that 6 to 12 month range is where we really try to get to and such. And so the focus is on building on that. And then we can shift to the long term. And Paul, I think this is sort of like our own personal lives. You know how when we finally got into done college and education, we started up our professional careers. And at first we wanted to just like try to get in a surplus, try to have 2 or 3 months of money sitting aside, right? And as soon as we start to build some savings and such, then we start finishing looking our focus on, aspirational issues, home, car, family, and those kind of things, putting away money for the future. And that's how organizations should be here. It's that, yeah, that first 3 months, right, Paul? We want to get that in. But after that, it's really all about the future.
Yeah, and where I come out with an operating reserve policy and how many months you need, I always like to think of it as a sliding scale, right? And I think 6 months is a good barometer. And maybe if you're less flexible, if you don't have the ability to call on a special assessment if you're a membership organization, then you want to go towards the higher end, the 12 months. But maybe if you do have that ability, again, not saying you should go below 6 months, but it gives you that flexibility if you have the ability to call on funds pretty quickly.
And I think that, Paul, it helps to look at it in three buckets. If you're just starting out or you're coming off of a tough time and you're building operating reserves, go to that 3 to 6 months and then make that goal. And always want that goal to be slightly out of reach. But then if you get to that 6 month goal, I like to push organizations to update their operating reserve policy. We'll talk about that later on, to maybe shoot for that 12-month goal. But I never put in more than 12 months as a goal. And I hope we get to 2 and 3 years of operating reserves, but the goal will be 12 months. Okay. And I think it's important to emphasize this point that no operating reserve is built to bridge a permanent or long term change. And that's why for short term usage, pulling money out of reserves, and we have a section at the end here, we're going to go back to this, that if it's something you're trying to bridge that's going to take a year, 2 years to recover from, try not to use operating reserves to bridge that. If it's something that's a temporary delay of a month or two, that's the ideal, time to use operating reserves. Okay. And my personal line, Paul, is 3 months. If it's going to take us more than 3 months, try not to use operating reserves. But, up to 6 months is good, but try not to go past that 6 month. And here's a couple of examples where it's really appropriate for delays and, a cancellation and a pivot that we might be able to replace, or I just had a group not too long ago where a key C-suite person had a medical emergency, was going to be gone for 3 months, and we needed to bring somebody in to help bridge that and bring that person back on. Perfect, use.
Yeah, and for so many years, we didn't have the real life examples of this, but we've had many of them again the past 5 to 6 years. You think about when the pandemic hit, almost 6 or over 6 years ago now. You think about the federal funding freeze last year. Those are real world examples, and I'd love to say, oh, nothing like that is never going to happen again. Something
And
like that is probably going to happen again where there's a disruption. We
yeah,
just don't know what it is yet.
it's
Um,
not if anymore, it's when, right?
yeah.
And
Yeah.
and Paul, I'm going to date myself here for a second, but it really had an impact on me. And I only learned my lesson so well, but when 9/11 hit, it was just total chaos, and we didn't know. And it really took 4 to 5 years to recover. And I just said, looking back, it's like, man, some things that we burned operating reserves on, it would have been a better guess that this is going to be a long recovery time and tried to have, rebalanced the budget. But then when the banking crisis hit in 2008 9, sort of did the same thing again a little bit. And then COVID, of course, I think corrected that we sort of knew it was going to take some time.
Yeah, and just to hit again on something you touched on a few minutes ago, if you're dipping into those operating reserves for more than 2, 3 months, and then it's time to reevaluate that plan. And that's why you always want to have your operating reserve policy linked to your strategic plan.
Exactly. And section 5, we're going to go over today. We're going to go over metering out. So it gives you a way to message around that when you're talking to people. And so we're going to come back to that concept here. So think about it from a life cycle point of view. In the beginning, you're trying to build those short-term funds because that's what we're there for. Because at any point in time, good or bad type of organization, there's going to be could be temporary shocks. But also recognize that there's a difference between a temporary shock and something that's longer term. And then we're going to talk about here in a little while here that we want to try to keep the focus on the future and such. So it's a key strategic benchmark, but it's also the guiding light for the future. So Paul, let's go ahead and talk about board engagement here and setting the goals and talking with boards. And there's 3 aspects that we want to break this down to. Is like the actual policy and talking with the boards about that. And you use the policy to raise awareness levels. And then we want to talk about how we communicate with them. Paul, this brings me back to the KPIs, which I think over formalizes it. But how we communicate, how we keep it in their peripheral vision. So setting the operating reserves, I think it's an educational thing. Would you agree with that, Paul? I think we need to constantly sort of talk about it.
Yeah, for sure. There's definitely an educational opportunity for board members. And I'd add too, as a part of board orientation, there should always be some financial component of that speaks to the importance there. Again, just realizing a lot of the leaders on your board, unless you're an incredibly lucky organization, they probably don't all have financial background and financial education and knowledge. So just setting that barometer for them to help them interpret, and then also helping them to say, okay, this is the appropriate level of risk we want to take for the organization.
And I think it's good to step back, Paul. Would you agree with the statement that a lot of board members don't have a financial background, and not all board members are sitting on the finance committee, okay? And where a finance committee is spending more time looking at the financials, right? And so we need to connect with them. And when they are looking at the financials, they're overlooking at what the budget, statement of activity, income statement, budget performance, and everybody's just more comfortable looking at budgets. But operating reserves are where? On a statement of financial position, the balance sheet. And we have to help show people, that connectivity there. So I think that's where this all comes in under that educational point there. And that third point there, that buy-in is very important, that they agree that operating reserves is a key metric. Just as important as hitting certain grant goals, revenue goals, performance goals, that it's one of their key metrics. And I don't think it shows up as that for a lot of organizations, but I don't think it's hard to put that in that KPI on the dashboard. And we're going to talk about showing operating reserves as number of months and things going up and down and how to talk about that. And we're going to break the policy down here in a little bit. And if you do A, B, and C, we end up with a culture that it's important to add to operating reserves and such. And one more thing, Paul, before we go on, one of my favorite formulas that I like to put out there, that N is always greater than R. That the needs of an organization that they're trying to fill are always greater than the resources out there. There isn't enough money on the planet to fix poverty, educational issues, and things and stuff. And so, could we help a few more people today and hurt our financial position or our sustainability or long-term health? So we got to constantly balance that to be around for a long time. Reporting is interesting, Paul. I mean, different ways how do you like to, put a report on operating reserves out with your board members? We're going to look at a sample report here in a little bit, but
Well, it depends on the board, Mike. I think you need to understand how they interpret information. I'm always a fan, similar to what you said earlier, in your how whatever your cadence is for reporting. Hopefully, it's monthly. Having some sort of dashboard and some sort of metric. There's a number of ways you could do it, just to say, here's our policy, here's the general guidelines, here's where we stand. And I'm a big fan of the stoplight approach too, using coloring. It sounds basic, but it works. Just to say green, we're in good shape, we're in alignment with the policy. Yellow, maybe we're still in alignment, but there's a little bit of danger. And red being, we're not in a good spot here. Have you used that before?
exactly. And we're going to show you that in a few minutes here. And Paul, to echo what you said on the first line, that word pattern, that you want to have a constant pattern of, reputation in your communications, in your reports. It's this time of year we look at it and such. And that will help the boards to sort of connect to it and not disconnect. And I think tying operating reserves around, of course, into our annual audit reporting cycle, but also in our budget preparation cycle and where we're at. We're going to have a section here coming up where we connect the operating reserve policy to budgeting guidelines and policies and such. Now, the policy itself, we're going to go through here in a minute. There's certain policies that, Paul, to me, are more risk safeguarding policies, like an investment policy statement that is subject to constant requirements that we need to meet and safeguards that should be looked at and updated annually. But an operating reserve policy is a longer term policy. And I think that comes into that 3 to 5 year range. So once you get that operating reserve policy up and running, that you're not going to be updating that every year, but you want to take a look at it. And to me, no longer than every 5 years, but in that 3 to 5 year window. And it might not even change much, but you do want to go through that policy. Is it working? Culturally, have we changed as an organization and such? So that brings us to this end of this section here. Now we're going to talk about the operating reserve policies as part of the and tying into your budget. And here we're going to break down the operating reserve policy. But what's interesting, Paul, is one of my favorite questions to ask organizations once I get to know them a little bit is like, I see your budgeting practice. I see you have a lot of rules and things. You end up with a bottom line, but do you have a guideline on what, or a target or a policy around what type of, surplus deficit in any one year you're looking for? And the answer usually is like, it's just, what feels comfortable. Would you agree with that statement?
Yeah, depending on the sophistication of the nonprofit, but what I 100% agree with is that all of them would benefit with some sort of tool like this.
Exactly. And I think it's one of the key benefits of the operating reserve policy. It'll give you a bottom line target and such. And I want to tell a story here that just happened a couple months ago that really made, in my mind, set the stage for operating reserves. So we're going to use the operating reserve policies to formalize a target range for a surplus deficit for our organization. And using the operating reserve policy, and to put this into the operating reserve policy, Paul, using your red light, green light, yellow light sort of area. So before we get to that, we're going to break the operating reserve policy down. There's lots of different ways to do these, but Paul and I, we've always used this like this four, and there's a fifth segment we'll talk about here in a minute. But we talk about operating reserves in terms of mission. Then we flip that into a percent goal. Talk about the budget bottom line that we're talking about here, and then a reporting vehicle. And if these four elements are in the operating reserve policy, and less is more, you can put it in front of someone, they can read it in a minute or two, and they can get their arms around it. Now we've done a legacy thing. We've put that, we've documented that for people for the future. I really think the discussion, Paul, should always start out why we build operating reserves, not that we're trying to build $1 million. There's no better way to turn people off on what operating reserves really are to an organization. Just talk about them in dollars. You want to talk about them in terms of mission and such. But I think, Paul, I've never written these words or put them into a report or anything, but I've used them verbally. For nonprofits, operating reserves are our working capital. You can't run a company without working capital, and nonprofits cannot successfully run and be healthy without operating reserves. And why does a for-profit have a working capital? So they can invest in equipment, people, future, and things. And that's what we need to do, right?
Yeah, I mean, non being a nonprofit is just the tax status. You still need to operate your company like a business, and that's what you're doing when you're developing and monitoring the reserves.
Yeah. And so what we're going to do here, oops, is we're going to go ahead and talk about number two is that once we've set that goal up of operating reserves in terms of mission, then we turn that mission into a percent of budget. We've talked about it, it's the operating budget. There could be some adjustments how you look at budgets, but I usually like to make it the core operating budget with not too many carve outs, Paul. The only time I like to do a carve out is if there's a special thing that's a one-off that you're doing a 50th anniversary thing, or there's something that's going on that's unusual operational, we'll pull out. So our budget, for 1 year went from 1 million to 1.5 million, and then it's back to a million. But Paul, here's your red, yellow, and green here, and you could adjust these for different organizations, but I think you look at the bottom and the top, and that middle ground is fine. But all organizations are at one of three spots. They're either near their operating reserve goal, above, or below, and such. Now, here's the targeting to the budgeting bottom line that's interesting is you'll see a little bit of a sliding scale here and such, but organizations that are farther away from their goal, in theory, I like to try to put away, you'll see a little bit more, i.e. that's surplus, at that bottom line surplus. So, on a $1 million organization, we're looking at 3%, $30,000 to $50,000, bottom line. And you'll see as we get even groups that are above their operating reserve goal, I think we should always still be adding to operating reserves and such. Any feedback on this, Paul? These ranges, it just gives you that.
Yeah, no, I think it's a good start again. And with anything, you need to tailor it to your organization and also tailor how you communicate it to your organization. And again, I'm going to come back to the orientation process because if you get to know the executives on a personal level, get to know what their financial background is, financial knowledge, then you can really go the extra step to tailor this to communicate to them and get them engaged.
So the story that happened recently, Paul, I think really sort of set the stage for this for me is an organization that didn't have an operating reserve policy we put into play about 2, 3 years ago. And they were starting to build operating reserves and doing well. In building the budget for the next fiscal year, a few months out, okay, we were getting close. When you're getting close, you start to look at the bottom line, your last few adjustments. And it was about a $6 million budget that had a bottom line that was a surplus that looked nice. It was six figures. But based on this 3 to 5%, and to them they used the 2.5 to 3.5% range, they were about 50,000 off. In the past, they would have been happy, called it a day. The finance committee would have said, fine, staff, and they were out of there. But we said, hey, we have this policy, and it's about 50,000. It's a surplus. It's not red ink. It's about 50,000 short of this. And those last finding it, and we're not just going to slam it into donations or something. It's really hard to find, even in a $6 million budget. It's hard to find 50,000. But we took the extra time, hit the pause button. Staff went back, revisited, talked through, came back, and we found it. But what was more important than finding the 50K was that culture, that pattern that we set up, that discussion, that I really felt like that set them up for the future. And they wouldn't have had that discussion if they didn't have that operating reserve policy with Section 3 in it.
Yeah,
I thought
said
it was
another
great.
way, having a policy like this facilitates having healthy discussions and facilitates healthy financial management. It leads to questions you might not otherwise ask.
And then I think the policy into something concrete is to have a simplified, Paul, less is better than more, sort of a status report. And you could set this up different ways. I think this is a report that should be looking back and looking forward a little bit. Okay, because you need to see where you've come. And before I put the report up, Paul, I always like to do this in an operating reserve class I teach and say, hey, an organization that's sitting on 12 months, I'm sorry, on 14 months of operating reserves, are they in a great position? And you don't know. Like right now, we're at 12 months. That could be their policy. But if you look back 2 years, and 2 years ago, they were at 23 months, and now they're at 12, right? Now it looks different. And let's reverse that. Let's say they're at 12 now, and they should be popping the champagne because 2 years ago, they were at 4 months. You see what I mean?
Yeah, it's all about the context of the whole situation. And while operating reserves are important and having a policy is important, without knowing the full financial picture, you don't know if you are where you need to be.
So, with that said, Paul, let's take a look at this little report here that does a little bit of that. Pretty simple. And I think it's always best to look at operating reserves not in dollars, but in the number of months. I think it's a telltale thing. And you'll see this when we get into the case studies and things. And if you look at it, if you go up, their actual operating reserves they've floated up over the years, they're up and down. But if you go to line 7, we can provide this template, and the good thing about the template, it has some notes on the bottom. So if you'd like that, just email Paul and I will shoot that over to you. And it's also up on the website. I provided a link in the chat earlier. That they've gone when the dollars look pretty cool, right? You look at the months, don't look so great, even though they're still in positive territory above 12 months. Because why? Because their budget has grown so much. And I think that a document like this, it's got to be done once a year because operating reserves can ping intra year, you know, depending on your revenue and expense cycles. But you do this. I like to put this out right after the audit comes out so we know the numbers are all locked down. But I think that bottom line 7 really helps people get comfortable with 7-figure, 8-figure numbers. 9.
Yeah, I think the months are really important too, because you think about what the single biggest expense is for most nonprofit organizations, it's personnel. And then you go back to how many months of personnel costs do we have in our reserves? Yeah, and this is just one example of a report. I'd encourage all of you to solicit feedback from your finance committee, from your board, whoever's responsible for reviewing this document. What else do you want to see in there? What else would help you to understand if we have the right level of reserves?
Exactly what Paul said. Listen to Paul. Keep your eyes open. What might work for one organization, one client, one situation might not work for even that same organization in a couple years. See how they connect. This report came out of an organization that had substantial, net fixed assets, and of course we carved that out. There's other small adjustments to operating reserves, but this we tried to keep it simple, and it just tells a lot with not too many lines. And then they get used to seeing this and how it changes from year to year. And just provide this once a year. This report's worth its weight in gold. It takes literally minutes to put this out and leads to great discussions. So the best benefit is you're turning this into a legacy action, which I think boards should be thinking more on board. It's not like where we are today, it's where we're going to be down the road. Are we helping? The one universal wish for all nonprofits is that when you're done serving on that board, serving on staff, whatever with an organization, that years later when you depart from that organization, that you left them in a stronger position and such. So to have a long life there. So Paul, that leads us to our second polling question.
Okay. Does your nonprofit organization have a formal written operating reserve policy requiring budgeted surpluses or contributions to operating reserves? If yes, could you talk about it? If no, is there something else you use? And as a reminder, please submit your answers in the chat in order to get your CPE or CAE credit.
So Paul, I'll ask you my favorite question. Before you get to see the responses, so I guess you can cheat, but I usually think that this is like a 50-50, but how's it coming out?
Um, It's about 50-50. My response to that would be I tend to think more organizations than not have an operating reserve policy. But as for it addressing the contributions or surpluses topic, maybe not.
Good point. And I think this is more, there's 1.8 million nonprofits in the United States, and a vast majority, about 87% of them, are under $1 million budgets. I think operating reserves are even more important for smaller organizations because it helps you keep the eye on the future a little bit. And I think larger organizations, because of the complexity and size and all that, are more policyized and probably will have one in, but they could do a better job with the communications. And the larger ones would, Paul and our recommendation would be to use that to add a budgeting guideline. Okay. So let's go to section 5 here about using operating reserves. And what we're going to do here on this section is talk about the timing and such. There's a bit of information we want to go through here, but I always like to remind myself, Paul, operating reserves are very hard to build up. It takes a long time. Sometimes it takes a little bit of luck, right? And being in the right spot at the right time. And so what an organization could literally spend 20 or 30 years building up during a unexpected disruption can blow through it in 20 or 30 weeks. I'm pausing for dramatic effect there. And 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 nobody talks about the big ugly. What's the big ugly? Well, we just took all this money out of operating reserves. How are we going to slowly put it back in? Nobody's addressing that.
Yeah, and this happened last year with the federal funding freeze for many organizations, right? All of a sudden, you get your funding taken out. It's a big concentration of your revenue. Now the question is, what do we do here? So yeah, there's always those disrupting events that can have a material impact on it.
So this is not A or B. These questions are simultaneous. It's like, when do we pull the trigger to pull money out of here? And then how much? And I just think there's simple questions, but I think, Paul, I hate being a finance person asking a question with not an answer. But I think these are times where, even with like something disruptive happens, I think we need to say, okay, we're at a point in time when I think we need to pull some reserves out next month. And then we should have the discussion, even if we don't know the answer to these. Okay. And so it's having that discussion will lead to a thoughtful set of planning. And so I think it's our job, and I'm assuming we have mostly finance people on here, that we need to ask these painful questions: when and how much. And we want to bring up this thing because we're going to get into this metering out here. But operating reserves are there for two things. And then this is red and green, right, Paul? I mean, there's a protective risk management element of operating reserves, 100%, right? And then really thinking of them as our working capital, our stability for the future. It's an advance the organization.
Yeah, reserves aren't all used for rainy days or negative purposes. There could be a new program you want to advance. You could want to bring on a new employee to help improve capacity. Those are all worthwhile and very common uses of reserves.
So let's talk about the short term real quick. And we saw that multiple times going back to March of 2020 through now. We've seen multiple disruptions of all different times affecting organizations different ways. But the short term, and reminding everybody that my bias is 3 months or less, but I will willing to go up to even 6 months that we're trying to bridge. What are the appropriates? And, delays that we know, the delay period, right, Paul? A temporary rescheduling of an event type of thing. And this list can go on, and we might even want to, I don't know if people would like to chat a few in there where, I love phone calls from people because you hear situations I never dreamed of, and we just learn from them, right? Where there's been this. And the delays aren't always on the revenue side. As I explained before, where we had that person at that organization was a key cog in the wheel for that organization, had to go out for some emergency medical, and we had to get some help in. But that person recovered. We could see it. Everything was okay. But we were okay, bringing in, a consultants or temporary staff person And so that it can be on, there's many different types of situation causes, but you know, I don't want to beat a dead horse on this, Paul. It's 3 months, maybe up to 6 months. But if it's more than 3 months or more than 6 months, we have to try not to use short-term operating reserves, and that's rebalancing the budget. Now, support future growth, that's the working capital side, and it's totally different, and that's why we want to have these funds. And Paul, I know you have a bunch of stories, and I do too, that in during the multiple disruptions, organizations that were well positioned that had operating reserves were able to go in and bail out and even purchase or acquire programs for organizations that were failing, absorb programs, keep programs running. Really took advantage of situations because they were able to fall back on their operating reserves. And we even saw that in COVID. It was a different set of circumstances, but the organizations that were in healthy positions were able to, they had multiple ways to move the chess pieces around the chessboard.
Yeah, said another way, it just gives you more opportunities and gives you more flexibility for growth and advancing your mission. So when we think about this here, now we have the questions, right? What we know and what we don't know. So Mike, when you think about having a policy for this, one thing that comes to mind is what level of use needs approval and who has to approve it, right? Like, is it a couple of members of the finance committee? Is it the majority vote of the committee? Any thoughts there?
Yeah, no, I think you have us what I like to call operational and then approval level. And that and you'll see this here, that staff management within certain parameters set up in the policy, and mine is up to 5% of that operating reserves, that the staff can go ahead. They should be informing, but they don't necessarily need approval of the board. And then above that 5% level, and you'll see that here in the spending policy in a little bit, that we're asking the board for approval. And then we'd like to have a break. And I'll just tell you right up front now, because time's running out. I like the breaks at 15%. So there's some combination there and such. Paul, let's get in our third question, and then we're going to go move into the metering out and the case studies.
All right. Either in your formal operating reserve policy or informally, do you have limits on emergency spending from operating reserves? Yes, no, some general information, or I've never thought about this or other methods.
Yeah,
Um,
just quick
yeah,
answer.
yeah. And I think this one, I tend to lean towards the 50-50, but we're getting more A's than I thought, which is great. That's awesome.
Perfect.
Yeah, and I think this is one of those policies too, to Mike's point, especially as you have turnover in the board and the finance committee, you want to make sure you're revisiting this at least every couple of years, right? Because, as board members change, risks tolerance and philosophies on this topic can change too.
Yeah, and one of the benefits starting with COVID and going for all the multiple disruptions, we've learned that we need to pivot and we need to consider that there's another change down the road. Paul, we're going to finish up here with talking about metering out and then go through a couple of really quick examples. And the metering out is just what we talked about. It's setting these limits. And so that question that just came up here, here's how we set the limits. It's round strategies and there's usage rounds. This one is what we define this, Paul, a little bit in the banking 2008-9 banking crisis, but where this really helped us was with COVID when that one hit. And we set specific ranges. And take a look at this. I know it's a lot on the page, so bear with us for a minute. That you notice that the first section, percent exposed, and then the proportion held for long term. And organizations that have, and we say above the reserve goal. So you look at this first line in each of the two sections, above the reserve goal. What we're saying is if you're blessed and have 22 months of operating reserves, you're going to be able to set aside maybe up to 40%. You'll define what that is. Because if you do the math, you'll still be, right, Paul, at your goal. Okay? Now, notice as organizations that are right at 12 months or organizations that are below only have 2 or 3 months, they have less that they can spend on an emergency basis. Okay? And they're holding more for the future because they just don't have the funds to dip in. So that's the percent goal. Okay, you got that? So hold that. and then layer on the percent goal with a rolling 3 month time period. Paul, would you agree with this statement? Most disruptions happen faster than you can react sometimes. And right. And so, for example, if a funding source is turned off literally overnight, and I used to be saying I'm joking. Now, in the last couple of years, we've seen things just disappear overnight.
Yeah, this exact thing happened last year and continues to fester itself.
Yeah.
Yeah,
And
I think it's impossible to make a full reaction real time. Now, what you can do is make sure you alert the other leaders in the organization to say, hey, this is happening. We don't have all the answers, but we're analyzing it. And that does, show a level of trust, a level of comfort there.
exactly. And to Paul's point, it seems to work in using 3 month periods. So that where that reaction happens, you pivot, but understand that there's some things you change really fast. So you're drawing heavier out of operating reserves. Then you have the next quarter and then the next quarter. And by the time you get to the third quarter of that 40%, and here's what we're doing. We're, round one, the oh my God, OMG, right? I call it round one is OMG. Round two is okay, we're breathing. And round three is now we've corrected. And you see, of that 40% or 25%, we're taking 60% of it. We're using it right away because you can only pivot so fast. And you just remember, everybody, 70% of most nonprofit budgets are tied up in labor and labor related costs, labor burden, and administrative costs and all that. And that's really hard to move quickly on and such. So, but this would be over a 9 month period, we're making the correction. So round one is OMG. Round two is okay. We're figuring out a plan, and round three is we're weaning ourselves off those funds. Okay, does that make sense? And so I think, Paul, the question we got earlier is great. We did that a little bit quick, and Paul and I have done this in 2 and 3 hour segments. But it's just the recap what we just went through, that we are setting limits. We are deciding if we're above, at, or below our reserve goal. We're defining, time periods, and then we're defining that last piece is a corrective period. Using 3 month quarters.
Yeah, and the reason I like the metering out, to Mike's point, is that it gives you good parameters, right? Like, said another way, it's how you determine if something really is short term, right? Because if something is short term, it's going to stay within these rounds. But if it's not, then maybe you will have already realized this. But if you haven't, it's, hey, we need to make a bigger change on the horizon. This is something that's here for, if not forever, for a longer period of time than we thought.
I had a group from North Carolina, and they said, "Mike, we did your OMG." What do you mean my OMG? They go, "We got hit by Hurricane Helena in North Carolina, and they went through this, and round one was OMG, and it just helps. Everybody will figure it out, but I think this gives a little structure to it, Paul. And to show that, we got a few minutes here to walk through a couple of case studies of these and to talk about it. And the first one, Paul, is we're going to do one on the positive and one on the negative and two on the positive to show the metering out here and such. I don't know if you want to take us through this a little bit. You could see the rounds 1, 2, 3, and 4 on the bottom.
Yeah, and everyone can see the case study here. I'm not going to read that back to you, but what I'd point your attention to, what I think is really useful and shows application, maybe a little more detail than we previously had provided, is if you go down to the rounds, right? So we've got our operating reserves available for use. That's 25%, which comes out to 375K. And then you can see how the 375K is split up amongst those rounds and what it's used for, right? And that gives you a real world practical example of how you could be using reserves for the quote unquote rainy day. And then, right, like another way you could look at this, say you're going through this, Mike, and we think round one, we've set aside 225K. Well, what happens if our actuals there come up closer to 300? We probably need to take a step back and say, is there something further we need to do here? Is this really short term in nature?
And Paul, this puts the mission to the numbers. That okay, so the dollars is 225, but what does that really mean? And you could see that they had some action steps here, and try. And you know what? They're not going to get there, but what they're also doing at the same time is they're looking ahead a little bit. And they say by the end of the year, we want to be back to a balanced budget. We want to stop the bleeding. I promised myself to stop saying that word, but I'm going to say it. You know, you bleed. That's how operating reserves are used. You're bleeding. And they have to stop the bleeding at some point.
We're gonna ban the cliche phrases here in a minute, but I agree with you. We need to stop the extra spend. We need to realize it's not temporary in nature, and we need to make a new plan.
Yeah. And but Paul's point is here, as we go through, you're going to keep adjusting. And the whole point is to get to round four where you're back to a keel where you could start to rebuild.
Yeah, and the other thing this plan does, again, we keep coming back to this term, is it really does give you a different level of trust and comfort with those charged with governance, right? Because it shows that management has a very thoughtful plan that's planned out on how to use these reserves, as opposed to Mike and I just saying, "Hey, we're gonna spend 375K. We'll let you know how it goes." Mike, doesn't this give you a different level of comfort with a plan?
100%. And Paul, I'm going to use one more word. I say to people, we have a plan, and I pair round three and four with this is how we're going to wean off the dependence on operating reserve. And we've figured out mission wise, this is a good use of our money, our funds. But how we're going to back off that dependence on these, that we're, no operating reserve protects you over a long term change.
Yep.
Okay, so let's look into a future one, how, because I don't want this to all be negative. So we're going to finish on the positive here, Paul. Okay, and here's an acquisition of a new program. And you can run through the numbers here a little bit. We'll slow down here for a second. And you'll see that they are sitting on, their operating reserves are sitting on 28 months. They're blessed, right? And this is a larger size organization. And you could see the dollars. And here, that's why I always like to talk about the operating reserves in months. And I think this is a great example why we have operating reserves, Paul. We could go ahead and we're asking the board for $4.5 million. No, Paul, we're not asking 4.5 million. We're asking for permission to use 3 months of operating reserves. While we have 42, which will knock us back. And in year two, we know these things, we're not going to be overly optimistic that we're going to continue to have startup costs and all that, which is going to take us about another month. So we have 4 months. And then if you go down to year three and four, we're starting to reinvest those funds back in. We're going to have positive ROI. Okay? Well, this organization will be stronger in year three and four than they were in year one by acquiring this program, even though they're going to burn down about $6 million of operating reserves. And I think this is a great poster child, don't you?
Well, it comes down to your question that's highlighted in yellow. Is this a good investment? I would say I don't know. I don't think I have all the information I need here, Mike, because we're not
Mm-hmm.
considering all the other qualitative factors too of, is this a fit? What's the opportunity cost going to be on our people? I would say it might be. I would say there are signs trending towards it, but yeah, this shows a real world example, and we're going to keep seeing consolidation in nonprofits for the very reasons you said.
And Paul, you keep asking those questions until the very end. And just real 2 seconds on example three, this one's going in a different direction. They don't have much in operating reserves. They want to do this to invest in hiring additional staff, but look at the payback period. And the question here, Paul, based on just the numbers, and of course you would know more, but this one goes the other way a little bit. And I think like this is too much of an organization that has very little operating reserves that they're investing, and the payback they might stay net negative.
Yeah, but conversely, again, focusing strictly on quantitative factors, I would trend more towards it's not good. Maybe there are qualitative factors that make this good, Mike. I always say when you should always analyze nonprofits by their programs to determine how they're doing, but that doesn't mean you can't keep a program that's operating at a loss if it provides some other benefit or furthers the mission. And same sort of thing
Exactly.
goes to this.
I 100% agree that, it's this combination of mission and financial health. And we're always taking a look at it and looking at it. So, Paul, I'm going to finish the last statement. Operating reserves help you to peer into the future. So we think, here's our, conclusion. It shows to be proactive and how to be innovative while protecting against short-term disruptions. So that's the end of ours. We're going to throw it back to you guys. How to get a hold of Paul and I are here. How to get to the website is here. Go to the operating. There's a whole section on operating reserve. You'll see dozen articles, podcasts, and templates. And reach out to us if you need us. Thank
Yeah,
you.
and we're always here for you as a resource. And thanks for your time. Nicole, we got a request. Will the slides be shared with participants?
Yeah, if you can get those to us today, we can send them out tomorrow in the follow-up email. Okay.
Terrific.
All right, fantastic. Well, thank you so much. Before you guys go, oh, Paul and Mike, could you drop your contact information in the chat for people as well? And I've got one last question for credits. Here we go. Take a moment and put into the chat now what's your most important takeaway from today's webinar. That's it for today. Mike and Paul, did you have any closing thoughts for us? Anything else you want to say?
So, my great example on this is it's operating reserves is in every discussion, even when you're making current decisions. I think it's always out there, and I think we just have to, without hammering people with them, try to have small teaching moments around operating reserves and look forward moments related to operating reserves.
Yeah, I echo Mike's comments. It's always going to be important, and there's always a different way to approach communicating it to those charged with governance.
All right, great. Well, thank you so much.